I am Jacob Vidrine, and you are listening to Gospel Tangents.
The source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Jacob Vidrine on the show. He's from the Church of the Firstborn. You may have heard of the LeBaron group. Now, they're an interesting fundamentalist group in the fact that they descend from a different line of authority than the FLDS and the AUB and all those other groups. We've had a lot of them on before, but this is the first LeBaron group that we've had, and there's even more than one LeBaron group. So I'm going to let Jacob tell more about his brand of LeBaronism. Ervil kind of gets the headlines because, you know, he had a hit list and was a murderer and died in jail and everything. And but anyway, Jacob's not in that group for sure. So anyway, I'm going to let Jacob tell more about LeBaronism and the Church of the Firstborn. And so it's going to be a super fun conversation. You won't want to miss it. Check it out. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have a newcomer on the show. Could you tell us your name and which religious group are you with?
So my name is Jacob Vidrine, and a lot of people would consider me, I'm a fundamentalist, and most people would consider it the Church of the Firstborn, or Ross LeBaronite, I guess would be the colloquial term that's used by other fundamentalists to distinguish, because most groups have kind of their official name that they refer to themselves, and then, you know, the nicknames that, you know, make it easy to distinguish between the different groups.
Yeah, and apparently there's more than one LeBaron group.
Yeah.
Because I know what pops up in my head is Ervil LeBaron, but you're not associated with Ervil LeBaron.
Yeah, and I really I've never actually met anyone that is from the LeBaron family. So
okay.
I really have no specific connection other than that I find the family history very fascinating.
Yeah.
And the priesthood lineage coming down through that family line, and the teachings of certain members of the LeBaron family. But I would say not everyone I'd say that the LeBaron family kind of had two main groups, basically. There was the Mexico LeBarons that kind of stuck together as a family for the most part until Ervil split off, and then there was all the terrible things that happened.
We're going to talk about Ervil, even though that's not part of your thing. But I think you understand the LeBaron history way better than I do, at least. And so I kind of want to talk about all the little split-offs and everything.
So like Ross LeBaron, he was the second oldest son of the family father, Patriarch Almader LeBaron Sr. And Ross basically separated and spent most of his life teaching and doing his ministry in the Utah area. And so he was not ever really affiliated with any of the stuff that happened down in Mexico, except for he had some interactions with his brothers, but they were very minimal, especially later on in his life. So,
okay.
Yeah. And so I'm with the Ross LeBaron line
as opposed to the Ervil.
And
Ervil is
so there was Joel LeBaron, who started the Church of the Firstborn, the fullness of times in Mexico, and they grew to be a pretty significant group in their heyday. I think they had several thousand members at their peak before there was a schism between Ervil and Joel, and it got violent and all those.
Ervil was a violent dude.
Yeah, very terrible things that happened. And so I'm not as familiar with the Mexico LeBarons. I am somewhat familiar with the history there. I've studied it quite a bit. But I haven't, that's not where my focus has been. But I would say that I am fascinated with not just early Mormon history, but I am fascinated with fundamentalist history in general. So all the different lines have come down, the Woolley line, the Kingstons, all the different groups that have come out of Mormon fundamentalism.
Well, and that's the thing. When most, especially LDS people, talk about fundamentalists, it's always FLDS. Pretty much always. That's what, when people think of polygamists, it's always FLDS. And so what's fascinating to me, and because most of the groups, there was originally kind of I don't want to call them FLDS group, but it was kind of the polygamous group that became FLDS and then AUB. But the LeBarons and the Kingstons, correct me if I'm wrong here, have a different line of authority than the FLDS. I'm going to call it FLDS.
The Lorin
that's
Woolley.
not a really good thing. The Lorin Woolley group, yes.
Yeah.
The Lorin. So can you briefly, because I definitely want to dive into LeBarons. You're my first LeBaron I've ever talked to, so I'm excited about that.
Or firstborner, I guess, is a term.
Firstborner.
Just
Is that
to
what you're saying?
distinguish. Yeah, we sometimes use the term firstborner just because it's not as tied to the LeBaron family anymore, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, especially you want to get away from Erbil.
Yes, yeah. The name LeBaron has such stigma attached to it, so for a good reason. I mean, unfortunate for all the good people that are LeBarons, out there, but yeah. So some of the fundamentalist history, like you're right, that the Kingston line and the LeBarons kind of have a distinct authority claim that's separate from most fundamentalists who. I think I've seen people say that 80 or 90% of fundamentalists trace their priesthood origin story back to the Lorin Woolley story.
Right.
And so that was the story that John Taylor in 1886 received a revelation telling him that plural marriage was never to be taken from the earth. And he had visitations of Christ and Joseph Smith. And he set apart men separate from the church to keep alive plural marriage no matter what. And there's, different takes on how much of the Lorin Woolley story is historical and how much isn't. I definitely lean towards I appreciate Brian Hale's work on Mormon fundamentalism. I think he's done a lot of great history. He has an apologetic purpose for it, to defend the church against the fundamentalists.
The LDS church.
Yep. And so, but he's done a lot of great work kind of building on what Max Anderson in the 70s and 80s had put together on, basically kind of studying the veracity of fundamentalist beliefs as they fit in with historic Mormon teachings, and also the authority claim issue, which is a big thing. And so, with the church, there's certain things that would be incongruent. There's been development over time with the church's practices and theological views. I think I saw Jonathan Stapley recently said that anything that is stagnant is dead. If something is living, it's going to continue to change and develop. And,
interesting.
He was kind of talking about the development of
the temple
rituals. Yeah, that's what his recent book is on. And so I think that's true. There is development. And, but there's some tensions between early Mormon practices and, say, the practices that the church has today in certain regards. And similarly with fundamentalists, there are certain things that they believe that, are hearkening back to that earlier day. And then there's other things that have kind of innovated and developed that would also kind of be, does that really match what was taught in the early days? And so I think like Max Anderson and Brian Hales have tried to kind of highlight where fundamentalists would differ, whereas fundamentalists would kind of highlight where the church differs, if that makes sense. And so it's
all perspective.
Yeah, it's all about perspective, and I like to take it from history for history's sake, not just as an apologetic, what I want to defend, what I believe in. I think that there's a lot of value in kind of, stepping back and taking, like the classroom approach, where you are not trying to convert your students, right? You're just trying to teach them, explain information to them.
Yeah.
And so, and it can be tricky, I guess, when you're dealing with religious beliefs, right? Because people have their biases and their beliefs. But with the Lorin Woolley story, there's arguments for it. I think D. Michael Quinn, to be fair, he was a brilliant historian, and he was working before his death on New Fundamentalist History.
Right, he was, yeah.
And it's a shame that he didn't finish that project, but he did release a couple, I think he did some Sunstone presentations, if I'm remembering right, and he released some papers.
And I do believe Signature is trying to finish his book with obviously somebody else since he passed away, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll be excited to see that when that comes forward. But I would say that he kind of takes a thing where he thinks that there is some veracity to the claim of ordinations by John Taylor. He thinks, at least when I was reading his I think it was 2019 paper on John Woolley, he leans in the direction that there was something to the story.
'Cause Brian sure doesn't.
Brian definitely doesn't. I definitely lean more on Brian's side, and that's mostly not because of Brian's arguments per se, but Don Bradley actually wrote a fascinating paper back in the day studying Lorin Woolley, and he was taking what I think Don Bradley does better of taking a very neutral approach where you're not trying to convert the classroom, you're just laying out historical data. And his take on Lorin Woolley was that Lorin Woolley would take cool stories and kind of grow them and he entitled this paper "The Mythmaker of Mormon Fundamentalism."
Oh.
And he just said that Lorin Woolley was a brilliant storyteller, and that's what captivated and drew all these fundamentalists to him, was that he could tell a compelling story, and he would incorporate his audience, like people he's telling the story to. He said, "Oh yeah, like your relative was involved with this story." And so what Don Bradley put in his paper that I found particularly compelling was that this pattern of exaggeration can be documented with Lorin Woolley's own priesthood ordination, where he, according to his own personal record, initially wrote that he was ordained an elder at age 16. Then over time he exaggerated by a man who was ordained by Brigham Young. And over time he changed that to he was ordained by Brigham Young, and he lowered the age, saying he was 13 years old. And so you kind of have this pattern of exaggerating stories. And this is not to say there isn't truth to aspects of the Lorin Woolley story, but my personal belief is that the evidence for ordinations is lacking. It doesn't start to show up until the 1920s. And what Don Bradley kind of articulated, which I found compelling, was that it was right after Heber J. Grant said all these men who are claiming authority to keep alive plural marriage, they do not have authority independent of the key holder in section 132 verse 7, and therefore anything they're doing isn't valid. And so and he said these patriarchs trying to do plural marriages are not doing it validly. And so Don Bradley says that immediately after, Lorin Woolley says, actually me and two other people were ordained apostles by John Taylor. And so you kind of have that connection that Don had made. And I thought it was a pretty brilliant connection there.
Do you know the name of the paper?
I think you can find it on Brian Hill's website.
Okay.
The Mythmaker of Mormon Fundamentalism.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
But there is some truth. I'm not going to throw out all of the Woolley claims. I think every story there's when you've studied all the different lots of different branches of the restoration, and there's always a nugget to various authority claims. Like the Cutlerites have something, or LDS have something. Everyone has something to kind of that's the basis for their belief system. And I do think that there is truth, or at least documented evidence that John Taylor did have. Well, we know the 1886 revelation is authentic because the church has finally released.
That just happened.
The original copy, in July of this year. Historians already kind of knew that the text of that revelation was authentic before that, generally speaking. But
it does appear to be in John Taylor's hand.
Yep, and the church is finally saying that right on the church history guide. But I do think not just the revelation, but also there's evidence that John Taylor had some theophanies while he was on the underground, as it was called, in hiding during the last several years of his life. And so, one of them comes from Abraham Cannon's journals I think it was 1891, where he says that he records Marino Merrill, one of the temple presidents. I don't remember which temple. I think it was the Logan, if I'm remembering right. But he says that before John Taylor died, he said that John Taylor had told him that he had been visited by the prophet Joseph Smith while his son, Joseph III, was preaching in Utah, and that John Taylor, John Taylor related that Joseph was sad to see his son trying to tear down what he had given his life to establish. What this account in 1891 by a temple president, an apostle, said. And so you do have little nuggets like that. And I think as early as 1886, there's Philo Dibble is telling somebody, and it's recorded in a Latter-day Saints journal, that John Taylor had Joseph Smith appear to him in his body. And so that's kind of a very interesting journal entry that seems to kind of corroborate different parts of, the fundamentalist story, if that makes sense.
Okay. So you've done a really good job of explaining we'll call them the Woolleyites, which is FLDS, AUB, etc. So where do Kingstons and LeBarons originate? Because they're outside of the Woolleyite group.
Yeah, and some people try to, I think I've seen some charts try to say that LeBarons broke off from the Woolleys in the 1950s. Okay. And I don't think it's partially true because there were a lot of the LeBaron family that were involved with the Woolley group. And so they mistakenly interpret that to mean the whole authority line was a part of the Woolley line, when it wasn't. The family father, Almadair LeBaron, he had a very distinct priesthood claim, and he was friendly with other fundamentalists, but he still maintained his distinct claim, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And so Lorin Woolley shows up in the 1920s and starts telling about John Taylor, these stories about John Taylor in the underground. The
8-hour meeting and all that. Yeah,
and there's the 1929 canonized version that Musser wrote down, and Woolley, I think, put his name to it and said this is the certified account of it. And so that's kind of where most fundamentalists trace their authority from. The Kingstons, I believe, initially did have some connection, or at least some sort of friendly relations, but their authority claim is of a new dispensation, or I think Eldon Kingston had some sort of visitation where messengers gave him authority, and that was the basis for...
I thought it went back, or maybe I'm getting them mixed up. I thought there was something that went back to Benjamin F. Johnson and the Council of 50.
So that is the LeBaron.
Oh, that's the LeBaron.
Okay.
I'm getting them all mixed up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So LeBaronism sounds like probably the most peculiar out of any fundamentalist claim. Like why would anyone believe this story? It sounds...
Okay.
Who's Benjamin F. Johnson? Why is this authority claim given any weight whatsoever?
Right.
I think to understand it a little bit, you need to go back and dig into Nauvoo Mormonism, because there's a lot of stuff that Joseph Smith was teaching and doing in the Nauvoo period. And part of that was teaching that there was higher orders of priesthood. So Lorin Woolley came up with a theology to justify being separate from the church, the priesthood being separate from the church,
right,
of high priest apostles and a council of friends. That's the presiding kind of priesthood above the church, is what Lorin Woolley came up with. There isn't really historical evidence to substantiate that position. Like, if you were to look for a council of 7 friends in church history, that's like a secret presiding council over everything, you're not going to find evidence of it until Lorin Woolley sets up his own council of friends in the 1920s.
Right, and he claims that Joseph F. Smith ordained him, and
that John Taylor ordained him, and that his father, Joseph F. Smith, and there were certain men that were set apart to this council by John Taylor.
And he's the last remaining member, so he could continue it going.
Yeah.
It's kind of convenient in a way.
Yeah, it's very, and that's what Brian Hales would say is the weakness, but Brian Hales would emphasize the pattern of witnesses, and you don't have a second witness. I mean, the fundamentalists would argue that they have Daniel Bateman as a second witness to Lorin Woolley's story, but Daniel says he wasn't there for any ordinations. He says he was there for the meeting where John Taylor was talking about the revelation and stuff. And
okay.
So, it's not really a good second witness if he's not actually, didn't actually witness the revelation, but that's just kind of my perspective. Everyone has the different perspectives. What Lorin Woolley came up with was the idea that there was a higher apostleship above the apostles in the church.
The LDS apostles.
Yeah, and they called it the high priest apostle. And some fundamentalists still hold on to this. Others have kind of just, because when you try to press what's the difference between a non-high priest apostle and an apostle, a high priest apostle versus a non-high priest apostle, there isn't like a very clear theological distinction there. And I believe that even Warren Jeff's father, Rulon Jeffs, even made a comment that it was just apostle. Like that's, and I mean, and I've seen other fundamentalists in a variety of groups kind of take that position that there isn't really a distinction there. But in Lorin's cosmology, there was a distinction. There was this higher high priest apostleship. And so some people who were trying to defend that will go back in history and desperately try to look for evidence of there being like a distinction in the apostles. And the best that can be come up with is Wilford Woodruff in the Journal of Discourses makes one statement where he says, you 12 apostles, you 70 apostles, you high priest apostles, rise up and magnify your callings. Or, I'm quoting that, not, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But it's clear he was just referencing all the offices in the church. He wasn't, he was just referring to everyone as kind of being apostles in a sense.
Yeah, because it says in the Doctrine and Covenants somewhere, I'm sure maybe that an elder is an apostle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this was kind of what Lorin came up with. And there isn't really like there is strong historical evidence for there being a distinct priesthood that's separate from the church, but it wasn't quite that. And I think the place where it comes out the most in the Nauvoo period is during the trial of Sidney Rigdon.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with the trial of Rigdon.
Pretty. I'm somewhat familiar.
So the issue that one of the big issues there was temple ordinances, right?
Okay.
And Sidney Rigdon was performing temple ordinances, and the apostles are arguing that these were illegal. He didn't have authorization to do them, and so they're basically saying that we're trying him for his membership for illegal ordinations. But in those comments, that's where you get some of the first kind of last charge statements where the apostle said, we were taken by Joseph Smith through all the ordinances and given all the keys, and then Joseph gave us a charge to bear off, the kingdom to the world, basically. And so that was kind of, and so the apostles start to articulate their claim at that time. And one of the statements in there is by Heber C. Kimball saying, Rigdon has no authority except what he gets from the church. He was not in this council pertaining to the high priesthood until just before his start to Pittsburgh. And he has not got the same authority that the others have. And he goes, there were more than 30 men who have got higher authority than he has. And they said, there are men here, brethren, who have got authority, but we don't want to mention their names, for the enemy will try to kill them.
These are members of the Council of 50?
And so the question is, how do you interpret this statement of there being more than 30 men who've got this higher authority than Sidney Rigdon, who's a member of the first presidency?
Right.
And so some people interpret that as referencing the Council of 50. Some people interpret that as referencing the Anointed Quorum. Are you familiar with the Anointed Quorum?
I am, but my listeners probably aren't, so go ahead.
So the Anointed Quorum is the group of men, and later included women, in the Nauvoo period, where Joseph administered the temple ordinances to select close followers before the temple was completed.
Okay.
And so some people interpret the more than 30 men as being the Anointed Quorum. Some people interpret it as being kind of the Council of 50.
Okay.
The Anointed Quorum was started in 1842, with Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, George Miller. There was 9 men who were there where Joseph and Hiram administered the endowment ceremony for the first time.
Okay.
As Latter-day Saints are familiar with it. There was kind of a proto-endowment in Kirtland, but it didn't.
We would call that initiatory or washing and anointing.
Yeah, but it definitely wasn't the full ceremony with, the covenants, the signs and tokens. Mm-hmm. So that was the May 4th, 1842 meeting. And so my argument is that the priesthood that Joseph was conferring that was above the church was this priesthood that was given through making men kings and priests in the temple ordinances, which would later be associated with the second anointing in, later would be the terminology for that authority being conferred upon people. And so Joseph was, in the Nauvoo temple revelation, there's a statement saying that there's not a place on earth where God could come to and restore again that which has been lost to you or that which was taken away, even the fullness of the priesthood. And so some people see that and they're like, what's the fullness of the priesthood? Mm-hmm. And in August of 1843, both Joseph, in the sermon that he gave on August 27th, 1843, as well as Brigham Young, in a statement he made earlier in August 1843, said that the fullness of the priesthood is to be a king and a priest. And Brigham Young in the Nauvoo Temple said that Joseph, when he made them kings and priests, that he said he'd given us all that could be given to man on the earth, is what, how Brigham recalled that Joseph explained that authority. And so the terminology for it was fullness of the priesthood or highest order of the priesthood. Some people, like the LeBarons, would emphasize the terminology in Nauvoo of patriarchal priesthood. There's different people interpret the term patriarchal priesthood in different ways. Some think it's just referencing state patriarchs. I think D. Michael Quinn really argues that, and in his book Origins of Power, he really tries to say that he tries to argue that Andy Ehat was wrong in some of his arguments for saying that it was temple ordinances were patriarchal priesthood in some of what he had written. And the LeBarons would emphasize patriarchal priesthood as being temple to priesthood. But I think to avoid the ambiguity there with that term, and where there's different people define it different ways, the term was fullness of the priesthood or highest order of the priesthood. And it was this authority of kings and priests. And that is why the apostles would emphasize Joseph took us through all the ordinances of the temple.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand.
Okay.
Understand that. Are you saying the fullness of the priesthood is the temple endowment? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it's being a king and a priest. And it was the priest, and through that authority, people received the keys of Elijah. So the sealing power.
Sealing power. So...
Sorry, we're going deep here.
No, that's good. Because I want to be a little careful here. I talked to Margaret Toscano, and she said that the sealing power is the second anointing. And I know that's a touchy subject, and I don't want to go where I shouldn't go. But is that what you're referring to? With the fullness of the priesthood, or the sealing power is the second anointing?
So my argument historically is that Joseph wasn't just given... So in the washing and anointing, as people get it in the church, you're anointed preparatory to being a king and a priest or a queen and a priestess.
Right.
And most people in the church think that's the second anointing is when
you're ordained a king and a priest.
When you're actually given that authority. I think that there's solid historical evidence that Joseph was giving that authority in the endowment initially, and that later on the apostles basically changed it to only be preparatory, that you will eventually become a king and a priest. And they basically said in the Nauvoo Temple, we've only, some of you've been pronounced clean, but have you been pronounced clean from the blood and sins of this generation? No, not all of you, only some few of you who have deserved it. And so like William Clayton wrote about his endowment in the Nauvoo Temple, where he said that Brigham Young and George A. Smith pronounced him, anointed him a king and a priest unto the Most High God, and pronounced him clean from the blood and sins of this generation. And the evidence indicates that Joseph was doing that for other men in his lifetime, and separate from the second anointing, if that makes sense. So we don't even need to really get into what the second anointing is, because that is a sacred, touchy subject for a lot of people. I don't want to tread on.
I'm just trying to understand. So in the firstborn theology, are you saying that the endowment, that Brigham Young split off a second anointing from a first anointing?
So what Joseph did was making men kings and priests in their endowment, but this was not sealing them up to exaltation yet. The second anointing would make them be eternally a king and a priest up to exaltation, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole.
No, this is good.
I to simplify it, simply the highest, what Joseph was doing was, he was really trying to introduce this new order of priesthood. And, people received authority to perform temple ordinances in this priesthood. Sealing power being conferred, as you said, Margaret Toscano argues. And
Margaret argues that the sealing power, that anybody, well, this is what Margaret argues. Anybody who receives the second anointing, therefore has the sealing power. Now, I mean, that's a huge implication for fundamentalists, because, in the LDS church, only the prophet can authorize certain individuals who are generally sealers to do that. But my understanding of fundamentalist theology, which may or may not be Firstborn theology, but Woolleyite theology, let's say it that way, anybody who has received a second anointing can therefore seal any other couple.
Yeah. So that I think that's that there is sealing power conferred. The question is whether a person is authorized to exercise that sealing power or not. And
Okay, because in my view, Lorin, Woolley, and Joseph Musser and all these people, I'm pretty sure it was Woolley, had received his anointing, his second anointing at like age 27. He was really young.
Joseph Musser, yeah.
Oh, Joseph Musser. Okay, thank you.
We don't know if Lorin Woolley ever got it. Max Anderson said that he was given access to a lot of church records to defend the church against fundamentalism. He says that he was shown proof that John Woolley had the second anointing in October of 1886, so right after the 1886 revelation is what Max Anderson, and he shared that with Fred Collier, and Fred kind of included that in some of his.
Oh, I want to get into.
Yeah, we'll talk about that eventually, but yeah. So my argument is that there's this in Nauvoo there was this higher order of the Melchizedek priesthood that was involved being authority as a king and a priest and having sealing power.
Right.
And whether a person's authorized to exercise that or not is, there are some people who would argue it's an independent authority where you can use it as God directs you. I personally see a lot of evidence from the Nauvoo period where, like William Smith, for example, he was Joseph Smith's brother.
Right.
He wrote a pamphlet articulating his authority claim in October of 1845 against the apostles. And in it, he says, I was in the last council with Joseph shortly before going on my electioneering campaign in the East.
Right.
And in that council, I was initiated into the highest priesthood lodge and was washed, anointed, and clothed with sacerdotal robes of white and ordained to be priest and king and invested with all the authority that any man on earth ever did possess, to bind up the kingdom and to preach the gospel to the nations. And he said, because of these anointings and ordinations, I hold as many sealing keys as could possibly belong to Brigham Young.
See, and this is huge to me because the idea, to me, because a lot of LDS people will say, well, they're just excommunicated. They don't have any authority. Who cares? But from a fundamentalist perspective, if you received the second anointing and if you received the sealing power, excommunication just doesn't matter.
Yeah, you could argue if it's a higher authority. So like there's a statement referencing the Council of 50, and this was by people who were kind of antagonists, who thought Joseph went astray with the Nauvoo stuff. The Olive Branch, I forget which group they were called. I think there might have been the Brewsterites, which was this small sect in the 1840s,
you know a lot of groups. This is great.
1850s. And so they were writing about the Nauvoo stuff they were criticizing. They said that Joseph and Hiram, shortly before their death, ordained a council of 50, or ordained them kings and priests, giving them authority that no tribunal in the church could control. And so they're kind of recognizing that this is kind of a higher authority than the church, kind of, is how William Smith articulated. And I'd say that that's how the apostles were justifying their authority claim, was through these temple ordinances. And part of why they were trying to say Sidney Rigdon was illegitimate was they're saying he's ordaining men to be prophets, priests, and kings, which I believe was a shorthand term in Nauvoo for the second anointing. And they're saying, which is an office that he himself does not hold. And so they're like, who here in this church thinks that a person can ordain someone to an office that they do not, higher office than what they hold? And so that's was their argument against Sidney Rigdon. With William Smith, there was also, issues with,
Well, plus he was the church patriarch.
Yeah.
After Hiram died, basically.
He claimed patriarchal succession, which I think is, that's another compelling thing in the Nauvoo period, is that Joseph, I think there's compelling evidence, was intending his posterity to be his successors over the church.
Like Joseph Smith III.
Joseph III, being blessed. And that goes back before Nauvoo, where Joseph III recalls that in Liberty Jail, that he was given a blessing then.
Right. Then Mark Hoffman forged.
Oh, yeah. Hoffman tried to forge the Nauvoo one, is what he...
Oh, there was another one?
So he got blessed in Liberty Jail, and then he said he got a confirmation of the blessing in 1844 by his father. And he said, and so Hoffman tries to date that to January of 1844, and he wrote the whole fake blessing for that. And of
There were two blessings. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, and I think Joseph III actually said that there was, in the early spring, he was blessed, in early 1844, and then shortly before going to Carthage, that his father again blessed him. And so I think that's the most compelling witness for Joseph III's claim of being blessed to be his father's successor is from his own testimony. I think that's compelling. There's others who testify about it. I think Lyman White was somebody who talked quite a bit about patriarchal succession, how Joseph's posterity should be the successor over the church. And even Brigham Young, and I think that's probably the most compelling thing for patriarchal succession, is Brigham Young in Utah says, what if Joseph's boys, I've never claimed to be Joseph's. You hear the brethren say that I am the prophet's legal successor, but you've never heard me say so. I say I am just a good hand to keep the dogs and the wolves out of the flock. He says that he prays, continually for Emma and for the whole family. And when Joseph III started the RLDS movement.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jacob Vidrine of the Church of the Firstborn. In our next conversation, we're going to talk more about Kingston and LeBaron authority, the sealing power, and the second anointing authority. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Here's one of the clip from our next part of the interview.
And so you kind of have a tension in that Nauvoo period where you have certain people who are arguing that because they were made kings and priests, that they have just as many keys and power to seal and do all the ordinances as Brigham Young had.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.